Fusarium head blight is a really weather-driven disease, and so I'm going to talk about some research we've done here in Williston to help us manage Fusarium head blight in Durham. I know you're all familiar with this disease if you grow small grains, but I wanted to touch on a few different things just to remind us of the biology, because managing this pathogen really requires that you understand it. It's not very simple. So it's called Fusarium head blight because the pathogen is Fusarium graminearum, that's a fungus. So the fungus infects the wheat heads, and that's where you get that bleaching in the head. It infects at flowering, continues to grow, and then when you reach that soft dough stage, that's when you see the bleaching in the head. As it grows inside the head, it's producing the toxin, the deoxynivalenol or vomitoxin. And that's what reduces the quality. You also get reduced test weight from these scabby, lightweight kernels. So I want to touch on the disease cycle. That's not usually something I discuss with the pathogen, but it's really important for Fusarium head blight. We know it's overwintering on our crop residue. If you grow corn and durum, you're going to get a lot of head blight if you're going to plant that durum into your corn. So we know the pathogen is living on the crop residue. These little black structures on the stubble, they're called perithecia, and they essentially germinate and launch spores. To do that, they need a lot of moisture and humidity. They land on the head and they can infect starting at flowering and continue to infect the head until soft dough. So there's a period of time during which that pathogen can cause disease, outside of which it cannot. And during that period of time, you need humidity, and we usually don't have humidity here unless we have rainfall. So it's a very rainfall-driven disease, but don't forget your overnight dews. They can contribute as well. And then, of course, we get the bleaching symptoms. So when I rate symptoms in the field, I'm rating the bleaching that I see. And that may or may not correspond with the dawn in the grain. And I'll talk about some results we have on that. All right, so managing this disease, you need an integrated strategy. As you probably learned in 2016, there are times when even fungicides can't really help us out. But there are things that we can do to put ourselves in the best position possible. So there are some agronomic things. In 2016, I had some people talk to me and say, they noticed that their later planted wheat or durum had less dawn than their earlier planted crop. And that got me to thinking if planting date could help us manage this disease, and I'll talk about that project. I've looked at some durum variety, resistance to head blight, and then we'll talk about some fungicides too. In particular, fungicide timing. All right, so this planting date study concluded in 2019. This was a multi-state effort funded by North Dakota SBARE and the Montana Wheat and Barley Committee. Tahani Jabir was the graduate student on that project. And we had collaborators from the Montana State University Eastern Ag Research Center, Dr. Frankie Kretcher, the plant pathologist there, and John Rickertson down at Hettinger. So we had 4 sites. I managed the Crosby site, Tahani and I. Frankie managed the Freud and Sydney site, and then John managed the Hettinger site. So we were trying to represent, 4 kind of different climatic areas of the state. We had 3 planting dates, 6 varieties representing a range of varietal maturity. And as I said, this is a 3-year study. So the idea behind planting date helping us control this disease is that, like Daryl said, we usually have a typical pattern of rainfall where we get a lot of our rainfall in June and in early July. And you can see, apparently we're going to have a new average normal, but this was the previous average normal, that kind of bump right there, and it starts to go down mid to late July. And this is that's 2014 and 2015. The green is 2016, and they kind of follow that trend. So we have a reliable pattern of precipitation. But of course, you're always going to have that odd year. So can planting date, essentially, you plant, right? It's going to change when it's flowering, our susceptible growth stage. If it's flowering during the dry part of the season, we should get less head blight, right? But again, our weather isn't always that reliable. So these are the recommended durum planting dates, and you can find this if you search NDSU wheat planting date recommendations, and they're driven by yield. So the first planting date here varies by location, you know, how far south you are, how far north you are. So at the Crosby site, our first planting date was the first week of May, and our last planting date was the first week of June. The second planting date was in the middle. Hettinger, first planting date was the second week of April, and last planting date was the second week of May. Third planting date, second week of May, and second planting date in the middle, and so on. So again, these are driven by yield, and what we found in our research was, yes, absolutely, early planting maximized yield. It varied based on rainfall, so I believe it was 2018, first and second planting day, we really didn't see a difference, so that's about a 2-week period, and then the third planting date really fell off. So that's a month from your first planting date. In 2017, with our drought, big difference between first and second date in yield. So does early planting maximize yield? Yes. What about disease? So this is that bleaching. This graph is talking about the bleaching, the Fusarium Head Blight Index, and PD1 stands for planting date 1 and so on. And you can see it is lower on our third planting date. So we've minimized our bleaching symptoms in this case by late planting. However, when we looked at the dawn and the harvested grain, there was no difference across planting dates. And that might be counterintuitive, but remember, you can have dawn without seeing bleaching. And so in this case, we weren't seeing symptoms in the field, but we were getting dawn in the grain. Also, we had some sites, so green is Hettinger, and this is the planting date here, where the later planted had higher dawn, and some sites, the blue is Crosby here, where later planted had lower dawn. So we had opposite trends at different sites. And so what does this tell me? This tells me that in a given year, sure, you might notice a difference between your planted, you know, the different dates that you've planted in dawn, in the grain. Can you replicate that across seasons? I doubt it. Will you maximize yield if you plant early? Yes. How often do we have scab epidemics? Not so often, right? So I'll leave the decision making up to you, obviously, but it doesn't look like planting day is a reliable way to manage head blight. All right, so let's talk about varieties. I hope here today we've got our 2020 annual report for the Williston REC and the MSU ERAC. In that, we've got this durum variety selection guide. It's also online if you just Google NDSU durum variety selection guide. And all the way over on the right, you've got these head scab ratings. And they go from 0 to 9, where 0 is completely resistant and 9 is, and I'm sorry, I'm blocking the screen, is highly susceptible. There's no zeros on the list, unfortunately. That would be great. Mostly we've got a range from 5 to 9. But what do those numbers mean? Well, I was interested in looking at that, and handily enough, we have durum variety trials that are planted all over the states by our NDSU agronomists at our different research centers. So I worked with those folks right here. So we've got Eric at the North Central REC, the research agronomist, Meredith and Cameron, our dryland agronomy research specialists at the Williston REC, and then also at the Williston REC, but managing our irrigated station, Tyler and Justin. And this work was funded by the North Dakota Wheat Commission. So we've got all these different sites where all of our durum varieties are planted out. So all I did was take the grain and analyze it for dawn. And did that for 3 years. And so I've summarized the results over 10 site years. So only some of those sites we had measurable dawn. So I'm only presenting the sites where we had actual dawn in the grain to compare the different varieties. So here we've got Dawn vertically, so the higher the bar, the more Dawn. And here we've got the varieties that were included. And I've kind of categorized them by color, the ones that are high Dawn versus low Dawn. And on the low end of the bar here, those are the Scab ratings that those varieties are given. So Tioga has a Scab rating of 6, Montreal has a Scab rating of 8, and so on. And one pattern that kind of pops out right away is that some of the higher Dawn varieties don't necessarily have the highest rating. And you know, a lot of our data is driven by results from trials conducted out east. And so some of that might be climatic variation. But what we can tell from this research is that Tioga, Grano, Montreal, and Granora were among our higher Dawn varieties. And then these varieties here in green, Alcavo, ND Riblin, Joppa, Carpio, Lebsack, and Divide, were among our lower Dawn accumulating varieties. And all of our varieties that got a rating of 5 were reliably lower. So it looks like we can use that 5 rating as our benchmark. One interesting result is Lebsack. My colleague, Andrew Friscott, plants that as his susceptible check in his fungicide trials out east. And so this one might be a variety that really does perform differently east to west. So hopefully this data can help you select a variety with some good resistance. I know our ND Riblin is our latest release. All right, so on to fungicides. So just a refresher for the fungicides that we have available to us now, the timing that has been established through years of fungicide trials in North Dakota is the early flowering to up to 7 days later. So by early flowering, that's half the heads in your field have just started flowering. So just at the initiation of flowering, then 7 days later, you're still going to have heads out there flowering, right? So it's not when flowering's over. It's just 7 days post onset of flowering. So not a huge window of time. And the reason for that is, again, back to our disease cycle, right? When is that pathogen infecting? Right at flowering. If you spray a little bit later, maybe you'll catch some of those later flowering heads. And so that's okay. But if you spray before anything's flowering at all, you're gonna waste a few days of that fungicide application. And that's not a cheap decision. So we have this new product, Moravis Ace, and on the label it talks about efficacy at peaks 10.3, and that is half head. So it's kind of be in between these two images here. So half of the head is emerged from boot, which is a big departure from how we've normally used our fungicides for control of head blight. So I'm going to show some research, and that, again, is collaborative. I want to make sure everyone gets acknowledged. So Blaine Schatz manages the trials at Carrington, and Andrew manages the trials at Prosper, and Tyler helps me with my work here in Williston. They are conducted at Nesson Valley. So these are some of our 2020 data. This is from Williston and Prosper, so it's combined across the two sites. And so I'm showing 3 different timings here. So here we have Persaro at flowering, Carumba at flowering, and Moravis Ace at flowering. All pretty similar. And I should point out that all of our timings were provided a control compared to the non-treated. So that tallest bar right here is no fungicide. When you go to the early timing, it maybe looks like slightly more dawn than the Moravis at flowering. And so this is the Moravis at half head. Now this is the late application, so Moravis at 7 days post onset of flowering. Similar control, maybe not as good as at flowering. And then this is Persaro at late flowering. So it looks like the Moravis at flowering is slightly better than the Persaro at the later date. So overall, we see the timing at flowering appears to perform the best. And this is another trial conducted in 2020. So this previous trial, this is all on a susceptible variety of durum. And this is both susceptible and kind of a better variety, one of our 5s. So when you're planting or you're spraying on 2 different varieties, this is the data averaged over the 2 varieties. This is the non-treated check, and this is the Moravis at half head, and this is measuring dawn. So in this case, we didn't see a difference from the non-treated check when the Moravis was applied early. Fusarium at flowering, Moravis at flowering, and this is a double application. So this is Moravis at flowering followed by tebuconazole 7 days later. Obviously, we got the best control there, but I'm not sure anyone wants to do that. So in this case, it looks like the half head timing does not provide adequate control. All right, so just to summarize what I've talked about, while in a year anecdotally you might notice that planting date affects the dawn in your grain, just know that next year it could be completely different because it's all dependent upon our weather. Look for those varieties that have a rating of 5 if you want to see some protection against scab based on genetic resistance. And then for Moravis ACE, we're going to keep that fungicide timing consistent with the Carumba and Fusarium for Fusarium Head Blight control for dawn suppression. And I think that's it. All right. Happy to take any questions. Yes.
Does the Moravis give you a longer window than Fusarium?
Does the Moravis give me a longer window than the Fusarium? So when you're applying at, I'd say, I'm not sure. Yeah. I mean, when we compare the, oops. Well, when we compared Fusarium to Moravis, sometimes it looks maybe a little better, sometimes it looks about the same. So based on that, my hypothesis would be probably not. You would expect it to have lower dawn, right, in that case. So, but I haven't specifically studied that. Yeah, good question.
Audrey, the first herbicide pass in the spray, we were adding tilt to the spray. Is that doing us any good at all, or are we just emptying jugs?
So Dan's asking about the early fungicide application in the spring. Rule of thumb about fungicides is that you're only going to see a benefit if you have disease, right? Putting it out there, maybe it's cheap. We usually have some tan spot pressure, but it is really early, and typically the yield loss from foliar diseases is at flag leaf. You really need to see the flag leaf not being green, not being able to harvest that carbon for yield. And if the disease is not traveling up the plant, regardless of whether you put that fungicide down, it's not going to make a difference. So if it's a super dry year, that disease isn't going anywhere. Your flag leaf is getting burnt up because of hot weather, not disease.
And then, so kind of a follow-up from online. How about that early season disease potential when planting into pulse residue compared to corn, small grain, or oilseed residue? So,
right, yeah. Yeah, so, you can find some reliable data in the literature that planting a crop onto essentially anything that's not itself, obviously it depends, but planting small grains onto pulses have shown a yield benefit for sure. And part of that is due to that nitrogen boost. But another thing is breaking up the disease cycle. So yes, you're giving a year for that residue to break down, and that's where our pathogens are living. That's where the tan spot pathogen's living. That's where your head blight pathogen is living.
Okay. The comment there was, could you just repeat that question?
So would planting pulses ahead of durum result in better disease control than planting onto corn or durum, wheat, what have you? And my answer would be yes.
Audrey, I'm wondering the question about, is it better to go too early or too late with fungicide? If, say, you have a period of rain heading, do you go out before, do you go out after?
Right, so the question is it better to be too early or too late on your fungicide application for scab? Yeah, so I think we've shown that too early timing, that half head does not provide adequate control. That said, if you don't have any scab that year, it does provide some protection on the flag leaf. So it really depends on what disease you're trying to control. But yeah, you don't want to be too early for the head blight disease because again, it's infecting at flowering and it will continue to affect post-flowering. So that's why you'd rather be a little bit late. Not too late, of course. 7 days is still a pretty narrow window.
So when we're looking at our ants on susceptible, more susceptible, less susceptible, are those durum ratings, where do durum ratings fit in those that as you were talking about in the top?
Right, so the question is for our small grain disease forecasting system, you can select variety resistance, so you can select very susceptible VS up to, I think, MR, moderately resistant. Those are spring wheat ratings. Those are not durum ratings. I would go with VSS. Yeah, the level of resistance in spring wheat is a lot different from the durum. There's actually a known resistance gene that they've incorporated into spring wheat. And the resistance in the durum, there's not like this one gene that provides strong resistance. It's just some varieties tend to do a little bit better. So yes, make sure you're not confusing those and don't, if you're planting divide, that's not MR. All right, choose, I'd say probably S to VS just to be cautious.
I was going back to your slide of the different durum varieties. Is there any correlation between the age of those varieties and the scab resistance when you look at that chart?
Yeah, would it be possible to pull up this? Oh, perfect, thank you. I think in the guide it has the data release. Oops, would you advance? Montreal was released fairly recently, and that was at 8, and it had higher amounts of scab. So my first thought would be, no, not necessarily, because they're breeding for different things, right? They're breeding for low cadmium, they're breeding for solid stem, they're breeding for yield, short stature. So there's a lot of different things that they're breeding for. So here's some release dates. Let's see, Carpio was 2012. Divide was 2005. Let's see, where is Montreal? Montreal's 1998. And Grano was just released.
What about Lebstock? When did that come out?
Lebstock. 99.
The reason I asked is one of my neighbors went back to Lebstock, Durham, because he thought that older variety had more resistance.
Yeah, I don't think that's a rule of thumb you could necessarily follow. We've certainly got some older varieties that have pretty crummy scab resistance. I think, here we've got the Alzada, it's 2004, and it's got a 9. So I guess it depends on what you think of as an older variety, but I wouldn't follow that rule of thumb. I'd follow your head scab ratings.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
That chart would be a good handout to have.
Duly noted. Okay, good. You just call Chet. Thanks, everyone.